I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forg'd manacles I hear. How the chimney-sweepers cry, every blackning church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear, how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Let's take another look at that. Indeed, before the 19th century we had commons in which everybody, democratic spaces, could frolic and walk at their leisure. They were owned by nobody. But in the 19th century this was beginning to disappear. And Blake is mourning the disappearance of the commons. He's mourning the disappearance of places in which the public could walk free. And he's chartering a new world in which everything is privatized, everything is owned. In the second stanza we find the line, in every voice, in every ban. Blake is playing on the double meaning of ban here. Ban is both a proclamation and it's a restriction. In everything that Blake can hear people say, everything that he can hear, but also in every single law that he witnesses human beings make. He can hear the change that human beings are creating for themselves. This is not a gentle pastoral way of looking at the world. Blake is looking at a world that has been tortured, has been constricted by human restrictions, human laws. This is what Blake means by mind-forged manacles. He means the obstacles or the chains that human beings have created for themselves, that human beings have constructed to bring themselves out of harmony with nature. Manacles are chains. Manacles are what prisoners of the time would wear. Blake is saying that the problem with humanity is that we've lost the ability to trust in our own imagination, in our own incarnation, in our own liberation. We've mapped out and created these countless obstacles. In the second stanza, the word cry appears an overwhelming amount of times. It's almost like Blake is trying to draw meaning from this monosyllabic word. Monosyllabic meaning containing just one syllable. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, Blake is trying to capture a certain kind of auditory sensation. He's trying to convey the sheer pain and agony of the voices that he's hearing. He does this, and he's helped in doing this by his repetition of the word cry, this monosyllabic word. There is a motif of darkness throughout the poem. I think this is related to the religious idea of light, as it might be found in Augustine, for example, the way in which light is associated with God. We find the line, every blackening church appalls. I think by blackening church, Blake is not being literal, Blake is being figurative. He's considering that the church is losing its power to evoke God, to evoke Jesus. In the final stanza we find, but most through midnight streets I hear. Midnight streets, I think Blake is again associating these streets with an absence of tenderness and of love. He's associating them with an absence of God, but of course by God we're not referring to God the Father, who Blake thinks of as a jealous, awful, uncaring God. We're referring to streets that have lost the purity and harmony with Jesus. There's a motif of disease, of pestilence, and of negative spirits, of negative energy. Blights were plagues. A blight is, of course, where your crops are infertile, where they're not producing in the way that you'd want them to. Blights were plagues, the marriage hearse. Marriage hearse is an oxymoron. An oxymoron, it must be noted, is a phrase in which two words exactly contradict one another. Of course, this is linked to Blake's ideas about free love. So Blake is saying that this human and restricted idea of marriage is out of harmony with nature. It's not a custom which is promising new life. It's a custom that is instead promising death. Blights were plagues. Blake is using this motif of disease to draw attention to what is being created by marriage. I think a monosyllabic verb like blasts, as it appears in the final stanza, is making us think of industrial warfare. It's making us think of gunpowder. It's this very powerful warfare image, and of course this is linked to the idea of power and conflict. It's like Blake really wants us to hear the way that the city is exploding, that he really wants us to hear the sort of loudness that we now associate with London, and we were beginning to associate with London back then, but we didn't necessarily associate with London before in the same way. What does Blake mean by a youthful harlot? Well, a harlot is a prostitute. The fact that young women were being forced into prostitution was indeed an epidemic of the city. The idea of a youthful harlot's curse, I think Blake is referring there to something about the way that pregnancy is not necessarily related to this perfect desire, that people are being merely forced to raise children against their will, that children are dying in their infancy because of these harsh conditions of the city. Let's talk briefly about context. Blake is witnessing a world in the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was beginning to explode the population of London. London before the Industrial Revolution was merely a connected set of villages. One of these villages, Peckham, was the village that Blake himself lived in. Blake used to wander around naked in Peckham Rye, having visions, sitting on top of trees, communing with the divine spirits. In the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, Peckham is being subsumed. Peckham is becoming part of this vast, expansive, horrible industrial city in which old pastoral landscapes are being replaced and given way to by factories, by mills. This is what Blake is referring to in the poem, this new, perhaps in some ways exciting, but also demonic, also baffling city which is being created by the Industrial Revolution.